In this video, we're going to cover everything that Josephus discusses about the book of Daniel and all of his works. So far in our survey of 70 weeks views is that we started this survey by covering essentially 300 years after the Second Temple destruction in 70 AD. Then we moved back into varying Jewish views in what is commonly known as the Second Temple period, starting with the Qumran community, who were very likely the Essenes who harbored the Dead Sea Scrolls. They gave us a definitive pre-Christian messianic interpretation, so go watch part 33 for that. Now, out of the other ones listed here is that we are actually going to go to Josephus today, as he is very important in this discussion and categorically cannot be definitively tagged to any particular Jewish group like the Pharisees or the Sadducees. Josephus himself lays out his own genealogy that connects him back to the Hasmonean dynasty by saying that his dad's lineage is of a priestly line and his mother's is of royal blood. A short summary of Josephus's life is that he was born in 37 AD. During the revolt, he was taken captive by Emperor Vespasian, and then he was ultimately freed and commissioned to write his historical works. In this process, he takes on the Flavian house name, and is why he is known as Flavius Josephus, and then became the famous Jewish Roman historian, where he writes his four main works. The first three all have relevance in analyzing his composite view of the book of Daniel and its prophecies, including the 70 weeks prophecy. And because he covers all of these key debating points, is why we are giving Josephus his standalone video in this survey. Now, within the three highlighted works here is that we are going to address three major points today: his view on authorship, his view on the four empires, and the 70 weeks. If you have watched other videos in the series, is that you know that I have brought up Josephus many times on different occasions. But this time we're going to pool all that information together and also include a lot more information that he gives in his Antiquities and other works into this focused study. Our authorship discussion starts with Antiquities, where Josephus covers the history of Daniel in Babylon in Book 10, chapters 10 and 11. This is free to go read for yourself on Gutenberg, or there's sites like Sacred Text that publish public domain works on them. In large part, Josephus repeats the historical stories that we read in Daniel, but adds a lot of extra information there, like him saying that God manifested himself to Daniel during his youth training in chapter 1. That is not something that you will read in the biblical text. So, as far as authorship is concerned, is that there is no question that Josephus saw Daniel as a real historical figure, a major prophet, and the author of the book of Daniel, as he clearly says that Daniel declared the prophecies and all of them were composed into the book of Daniel, and that it is viewed as canon scripture here in Book 10, chapter 10, and at the end of chapter 11, he says the following: "But it is fit to give an account of what this man did, which is most admirable to hear. For he was so happy as to have strange revelations made to him, and those as to one of the greatest of the prophets, insomuch that while he was alive, he had the esteem and applause both of the kings and of the multitude. And now he is dead, he retains a remembrance that will never fail. For the several books that he wrote and left behind him are still read by us till this time. And from them we believe that Daniel conversed with God, for he did not only prophesy of future events, as did the other prophets, but he also determined the time of their accomplishment." This reference to the time being declared beforehand can only be referring to the 70 weeks. It's the only one that has a predictive chronology component in it. Now, there's two other places in antiquities that we have overt references to the book of Daniel by Josephus. The first of them is Josephus reiterating that Daniel predicted Antiochus's Epiphanes' persecution many years before. The exact number of years is spelt out in Book 12, Chapter 7, Paragraph 6, being 408 years before. This is important because we are getting our first glimpse at Josephus's chronology, which we will unpack more when we discuss his potential 70 weeks view. Now, the other one comes in Book 11. And oh boy, how this one just rattles some people's cages. The story is found in the last chapter of the book that is titled Concerning Sanballat and Manasseh and the temple which they built on Mount Gerizim, also how Alexander made his entry into the city Jerusalem and what benefits he bestowed on the Jews. So, you should already have the Alexander the Great prophecies from Daniel coming to your mind in this. Now, I'm going to read the entire chapter because what it says in there is simply just dismissed by critics. Yes, they do it too to Book 10 as well, but this is a little different. So let's read the whole thing and get a full picture of what Josephus said himself and then address what critics say about it. Here we go, starting at the end of chapter 7. Now when John had departed this life, his son Jaddua succeeded him in the high priesthood. He had a brother whose name was Manasseh. Now there was one Sanballat who was sent by Darius, the last king of Persia, into Samaria. He was a Cuthim by birth, of which stock were the Samaritans also. This man knew that the city Jerusalem was a famous city, and that their kings had given a great deal of trouble to the Assyrians and the people of Seleucia, so that he willingly gave his daughter, whose name was Nicaso, in marriage to Manasseh, as thinking this alliance by marriage would be a pledge and security that the nation of Jews should continue their goodwill to him. About this time it was that Philip, king of Macedon, was treacherously assaulted and slain at Egeba by Pausanias, the son of Serates, who was derived from the family of Oresti. And his son Alexander succeeded him in the kingdom, who, passing over the Hellespont, overcame the generals of Darius's army in a battle fought at Granicum. So Alexander marched over Lydia and subdued Ionia and overran Syria, or Kyria, and fell upon the places of Pamphylia, as had been related elsewhere. But the elders of Jerusalem, being very uneasy that the brother of Jaddua the high priest, though married to a foreigner, should be partnered with him in the high priesthood, quarreled with him. For they esteemed this man's marriage a step to such as should be desirous of transgressing about the marriage of strange wives, and that this would be the beginning of mutual society with foreigners. Although the offense of some marriages and their having married wives that were not of their own country had been an occasion of their former captivity and of the miseries they then underwent. So they commanded Manasseh to divorce his wife, or not to approach the altar, he, high priest himself, joining with the people in their indignation against his brother and driving him away from the altar. Whereupon Manasseh came to his father-in-law, Sanballat, and told him that although he loved his daughter Nicaso, yet was he not willing to deprive of his sacerdotal, divine priesthood essentially, dignity on her account, which was the principal dignity in their nation and always continued in the same family. And then Sanballat promised him not only to preserve to him the honor of the priesthood, but to procure for him the power and dignity of a high priest, and would make him governor of all the places he himself now ruled, if he would keep his daughter for his wife. Sanballat also told Manasseh further that he would build him a temple like that at Jerusalem, upon Mount Gerizim, which is the highest of all the mountains that are in Samaria. And he promised that he would do this with the approbation of Darius the king. Manasseh was elevated with these promises and stayed with Sanballat upon a supposal that he should gain a high priesthood, and bestowed on him by Darius, for it happened that Sanballat was then in years. But there was now a great disturbance among the people of Jerusalem, because many of those priests and Levites were entangled in such matches. For they all revolted to Manasseh, and Sanballat afforded them money, and divided them land for tillage, and habitations also, and also this in order every way to gratify his son-in-law. About this time it was that Darius heard how Alexander had passed over the Hellespont, and had beaten his lieutenants in the battle of Granicum, and was proceeding further. Whereupon he gathered together an army of horse and foot, and determined that he would meet the Macedonians before they should assault and conquer all Asia. So he passed over the river Euphrates, and came over Taurus, the Cilician mountain. At Issus of Cilicia he waited for the enemy, as ready there to give him battle. Upon which Sanballat was glad that Darius was come down, and told Manasseh that he would suddenly perform his promises to him, and this as soon as ever Darius should come back after he had beaten his enemies. For not only he, but all those that were in Asia also, were persuaded that the Macedonians would not so much as come to a battle with the Persians on account of their multitude. But the event proved otherwise than they expected, for the king joined battle with the Macedonians and was beaten, and lost a great part of his army. His mother also, and his wife and children, were taken captives, and he fled into Persia. So Alexander came into Syria and took Damascus, and when he had obtained Sidon, he besieged Tyre. When he sent an epistle to the Jewish high priest to send him some auxiliaries and to supply his army with provisions, and that what presents he formerly sent to Darius, he would now send to him, and choose the friendship of the Macedonians, and that he should never repent of doing so. But Jaddua the high priest answered the messengers that he had given his oath to Darius not to bear arms against him. And he said that he would not transgress this while Darius was in the land of the living. Upon hearing this answer, Alexander was very angry. And though Alexander determined not to leave Tyre, which was just ready to be taken, yet as soon as he had taken it, he threatened that he would make an expedition against the Jewish high priest, and through him teach all men to whom they must keep their oaths. So when he had, with a good deal of pains during the siege, taken Tyre, and settled its affairs, he came to the city of Gaza, and besieged both the city and him that was governor of the garrison, whose name was Babemeses. But Sanballat thought he had now gotten a proper opportunity to make his attempt, so he renounced Darius, and taking with him 7,000 of his own subjects, he came to Alexander. And finding him beginning the siege of Tyre, he said to him that he would deliver up to him these men who came out of places under his dominion, and did gladly accept of him for his lord instead of Darius. So, when Alexander had received him kindly, Sanballat thereupon took courage and spoke to him about his present affair. He told him that he had a son-in-law, Manasseh, who was brother to the high priest Jaddua, and that there were many others of his own nation now with him that were desirous to have a temple in the places subject to Manasseh. That it would be for Alexander's advantage to have the strength of the Jews divided into two parts, lest when the nation is of one mind and united, upon any attempt for innovation, it prove troublesome to kings, as it had formerly proved to be with the kings of Assyria. Whereupon Alexander gave Sanballat leave to do who used the utmost diligence, and built the temple, and made Manasseh the priest, and deemed it a great reward that his daughter's children should have that dignity. But when the 7 months of the siege of Tyre were over, and the 2 months of the siege of Gaza, Sanballat died. Now, Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem. And Jaddua the high priest, when he heard that, was in agony and under terror, and not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians, since the king was displeased at his foregoing disobedience. He therefore ordained that the people should make supplications, and should join with him in offering sacrifice to God, whom Jaddua besought to protect that nation, and to deliver them from the perils that were coming upon them. Whereupon God warned him in a dream, which came upon him after he had offered sacrifice, that he should take courage, and adorn the city, and open the gates, that the rest should appear in white garments, but that he and the priests should meet the king, Alexander, in the habits proper to their order, without the dread of any ill consequences, which the providence of God would prevent. Upon which, when he rose from his sleep, he greatly rejoiced, and declared to all the warning he had received from God, according to which dream he acted entirely, and so waited for the coming of Alexander. And when Jaddua understood that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of citizens. The procession was venerable, and the manner of it different from all of the other nations. It reached to a place called Suphah, which name, translated into Greek, signifies a prospect, for you have thence a prospect both of Jerusalem and of the temple. And when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him thought that they should have liberty to plunder the city and torment the high priest to death, which the king's displeasure fairly promised them, the very reverse of it happened. For Alexander, when he saw the multitude at a distance, in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with fine linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate whereupon the name of God was engraved, Alexander approached him and adored that name, and first saluted the high priest. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander, and encompass him about, whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, and supposed him disordered in his mind. However, Parmenio, all alone went up to Alexander and asked him how it came to pass that, when all the others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom Alexander replied, I do not adore him, but that God who hath honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay, but boldly to pass over the sea thither, for that which he would conduct my army, and would give me the dominion over the Persians. Whence it is that, having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing this person in it, and remembering that vision, and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I, Alexander, believe that I bring this army under the divine conduct, and shall therewith conquer Darius, and destroy the power of the Persians, and all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. And when Alexander had said this to Parmenio, and had given the high priest his right hand, the priests ran along by him, and he came into the city. And when he went up into the temple, Alexander offered sacrifice to God, according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priests. And when the book of Daniel was showed to him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, Alexander supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him, and bid them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers, and might pay no tribute on the seventh, i.e. the seventh Sabbath year. Alexander granted all they desired. And when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, Alexander willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army on this condition, that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers, and live according to them, he was willing to take with him. Many were ready to accompany Alexander in his wars. So, when Alexander had thus settled matters at Jerusalem, he led his army into the neighboring cities. And when all the inhabitants to whom he came received him with great kindness, the Samaritans, who had then Shechem for their metropolis, a city situate at Mount Gerizim and inhabited by the apostates of the Jewish nation, seeing that Alexander had so greatly honored the Jews, determined to profess themselves Jews as well. For such is the disposition of the Samaritans, as we have already elsewhere declared, that when the Jews are in the adversity, they deny that they are of kin to them, and then they confess the truth. But when they perceive that some good fortune hath befallen the Jews, they immediately pretend to have communion with them, saying that they belong to them, and derive their genealogy from the posterity of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Accordingly, they made their address to Alexander with splendor, and showed great alacrity in meeting him at a little distance from Jerusalem. And when Alexander had commenced them, the Shechemites approached to him, taking with them the troops that Sanballat had sent him, and they desired that he would come to their city, and do honor to their temple also. To whom he promised that when he returned he would come to them. And when they petitioned that he would remit the tribute of the 7th year to them, because they did not sow thereon, he asked who they were that made such a petition. But ordered that the troops of Sanballat should follow him into Egypt, because there he designed to give them lands, which he had a little after Thebias, when he ordered them to guard that country. Now, when Alexander was dead, the government was parted among his successors, but the temple upon Mount Gerizim remained. And if any one were accused by those of Jerusalem of having eaten things common, or of have broken the Sabbath, or any other crime of the like nature, he fled away to the Shechemites, and said that he was accused unjustly. And about this time it was that Jaddua the high priest died, and Onias his son took the high priesthood. This was the state of the affairs of the people of Jerusalem at this time. Whew, that was a lot, wasn't it? But wow, there's a lot to digest there. But obviously the biggie for us is that Josephus is sharing a story of Alexander the Great reading the book of Daniel, and is likely reading Daniel 8's prophecy of the goat's notable horn, the first king of Greece, and interpreting that to be himself. So, how do late daters reply to this? Well, our old friend Jimmy Montgomery, in his commentary on Daniel 2:46 through 49, brings up Josephus' story of Alexander with Jaddua, but does not mention Alexander reading Daniel. Jimmy's discussion on it is about comparing Nebuchadnezzar's praise of Daniel with Alexander's adoration of Jaddua. He doesn't mention Alexander reading Daniel's prophecies, but throws in the comment that Daniel 2's story was inspired by the Alexander story for the 2nd century BC pseudo-writer in his mind. But take note is that although Jimmy isn't going to back the idea of Alexander reading Daniel, but he is backing the story that the story of Alexander visiting Jerusalem was established before the Maccabean revolt, and therefore a very likely historical event in Jimmy's mind. Just lock that away. Our next late date commentator is John Goldingay in the Word Biblical Commentary series. He too focuses in on Nebuchadnezzar's worshiping of Daniel with citing Josephus' story. He doesn't say anything about the Alexander story, but when he discusses the Daniel 2 story, is that he is placing it in a Hellenistic context of creation, i.e., mid-2nd century BC. And finally, there's John J. Collins. This is the main commentator that critics and late daters turn to as their modern-day champion of the 2nd BC authorship view. He, too, brings up the Alexander story with comparison to Nebuchadnezzar. Collins, though, adds the word allegedly to Josephus' story. So basically, Collins is saying, I don't believe it happened, but I can't prove it that it didn't happen, as I don't have a reason to say Josephus was just making it up. But let me throw some doubt on it, because I know the story describes Alexander reading the book of Daniel, and that pretty much invalidates my entire commentary and endless articles placing it in the mid-2nd century BC. I would say that's probably a paraphrased thought in his head. So, I will be clear. These scholars are intentionally not bringing it up. Well, why should they when they know that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC? No, they don't. And, sorry, that is circular reasoning at the end of the day. You can throw all the critics into this little loop, but eventually it all just goes around in a circle. And the same thing goes for the discussion with Jesus' prediction in the Gospels of Jerusalem's future destruction and why they, critics, date the Gospels after 70 AD, regardless of internal and external evidences that say that the synoptics were well written before this. But I don't want to digress here too much onto that topic as well. It's just the same arguments, just applied to a different situation. But what you saw is that these late date scholars would bring up the comparison of Alexander and Nebuchadnezzar, but none of them would even mention the fact that 3 sentences later, it said that Alexander read Daniel. I don't know how you get to just pick some and avoid the other, whatever. But all right. Now, if you were sent, or if you were to start Googling for discussion or scholarly articles on this topic, is that for me, it took a few combinations to actually retrieve something that dealt with it properly. There's 2 articles you could find. One that is really in-depth, and a really in-depth attempt on the topic, and kind of one that I would kind of say is a little clickbaity. The latter, the clickbait one, can be found on the University of Chicago page or be read in JSTOR for free with your monthly article allowance. The clickbait piece to me is that this kind of focused more on the iconography depictions of Alexander and Daniel and not really on Josephus' account. One shows Alexander riding the leopard, i.e. the 3rd beast from Daniel 7, on a stained glass window from the 13th century, and another depicting the scene from Josephus about Jadua showing Alexander Daniel 8, also from the 13th century. I guess the couple of gleaning things in this article is that he does bring up the story, but his only comments on it are saying that the visit to Jerusalem does not form part of the description of Alexander's life by Curtius Rufus or Pseudo-Callisthenes, who were the principal sources of the rich European Alexander tradition. Rufus wrote the histories of Alexander the Great, likely while in Alexandria, according to Tacitus. This is dated to 43 AD, so it is an early historical compilation of Alexander's life. Pseudo-Callisthenes comes from the early 4th century AD, though. Our article author, Cress, does acknowledge that Alexander's visit to Jerusalem did occur in Historia de Praelius in the 10th AD. The point for Cress is likely to cast doubt on Alexander visiting Jerusalem at all during his conquest across the Near and Middle East. But here's the thing. Did Alexander conquer Jerusalem militarily? No. So maybe an argument from silence is not the best approach here, but it is the one that critics take. No visit to Jerusalem, therefore no reading of Daniel. That's essentially their aim. And the other and worthwhile article is Shay Cohen's article, Alexander the Great and Jaddua the High Priest, according to Josephus. Cohen is a professor at Harvard, and there's a chance you've probably seen him on TV a few times with some documentaries. This article is longer, but it is easy to digest in my opinion. His focus is the text side of the story. Cohen and other scholars prior to him see three independent strands being juxtaposed together by Josephus that make up the chapter. While I was reading it, is that you might have felt like the story kind of abruptly stopped, maybe rewound back, or suddenly interrupted and started going from a totally different angle. All of a sudden we're about Manasseh and Sanballat, and then boom, all of a sudden it's Alexander. Like what? A little bit of confusing. I get it, but the three strands that, according to them, are 1, Sanballat and Alexander, 2, Jaddua and Alexander, and 3rd is the military conquest of Alexander. An example of this juxtaposition is found right at the beginning of the story that we're reading. You can see this as the story started with Jaddua, Manasseh, and Sanballat as the main characters, with reference to Sanballat marrying off his daughter to Manasseh. Then we stopped and start discussing Alexander's rise as king and his conquest. Then stop this description by picking back up with the Jerusalem elders mad that Manasseh married a foreigner. So if we pull out the Alexander lines, we can see how smoothly line 303 goes right into 306. But Josephus juxtaposed the Alexander strand into the Sanballat strand. Weird reading to us today, but this is how Josephus wove these accounts together. Now, Cohen's main focus is to take the reader into the idea of Josephus shaping the narrative to his desire, and likely the one who anachronistically inserted the part about Alexander reading Daniel into the second strand, and that the second strand about Jaddua and Alexander post-dates, of course, 160 BC, which is after the Maccabean revolt, which of course is after the late date that critics give Daniel, which Cohen himself is going with. So we know he is going to frame his view of Josephus' story around this perspective, and is part, if not the main reason, why Cohen summarized saying, the historical Alexander did not visit Jerusalem, did not do obedience to the high priest, and did not sacrifice to the God of Israel, because he was too busy conquering the world to bother with an insignificant inland people living around a small temple. Wow. Those are some pretty confident words and stance against Josephus' account. So let me push back on Cohen here a little bit. Is it really far-fetched for Alexander to go 60 miles after all of his journeying across the Mediterranean and, Near East, to go to the capital, the center point of the Levant's main ethnic population? No. Especially if Alexander requested for military aid and was denied by them before moving into Egypt. Having total control over Levant is part of every single Near East conquest mission. It's the highway and center point between the three continents. Now, with the procession, does it fit the ancient Near East custom? Yes. Cohen himself describes the ancient custom, and it fits the exact same style, with the city decorated, temples opened up, festival-like atmosphere, priests leading the procession, with sacrifices made in the temple, including by the distinguished guest, and this is exactly what we read about Alexander doing when he took over Babylon in Arrian's work entitled Anubis of Alexander. Book 3, chapter 16, verses 3 through 5. In this conjecture, Darius was mistaken, for when Alexander started from Arbela, he advanced straight towards Babylon. And when he was now not far from that city, he drew upon his army in order of battle and marched forward. The Babylonians came out to meet him in a mass with their priests and rulers, each of whom individually brought gifts and offered to surrender their city, citadel, and money. Entering the city, Alexander commanded the Babylonians to rebuild all the temples which Xerxes had destroyed, and especially that of Belus, whom the Babylonians venerated more than any other god. Alexander then does some appointing of leadership in Babylon with the last line saying, "Here also he met with the Chaldeans, and whatever they directed in regard to the religious rites of Babylon, he performed. And in particular, he offered sacrifice to Belus according to their instructions." The pattern and details are in line with one another, with citizens and priests coming out, welcoming Alexander, so he doesn't think that, they're locking themselves in, for siege preparation. And the sacrificing to the foreign god by Alexander is happening in the same pattern which he was directed by them to do in a certain way. It was his way of saying, hey, you know what? Keep your religion. I don't care as long as you understand who's your new ruler now. And although some might say that Josephus just took it from the Arian story, is sorry, because Arian's work comes after Josephus, and we know that Cohen and other scholars see Josephus using 3 different stories, all coming from the pre-Christian era. And my final pushback on Cohen is him saying that Josephus anachrostically inserted the Book of Daniel reference into the second strand. Because, sorry, it falls perfectly within the second strand. It's seamless when you read that part of the story. In no way does it interrupt the text or the flow of it. It actually offers more reason of why Alexander would grant their requests after experiencing his dream of the high priest and seeing a prophecy in live action of him in the temple of the God of the Jews. Now, I'll let Cohen and others push back on the historicity of the story, because one thing that they note, and that is true, is that as Cohen is closing out his arguments towards the whole of him saying that this never happened at all, is that he said that in Against Apion, one of Josephus' other works, is that Josephus gives us a list of monarchs who sacrificed at the temple in Jerusalem, or others showed respect to the Jews, but he omits Alexander's visit to Jerusalem. This omission demonstrates Josephus' sloppiness. Cohen's point is that Against Apion, which was written after Antiquities, and this is something that Josephus himself, from the outset of the work, says so, that Antiquities was done before, is that if that story is true, then why wouldn't Josephus include it with his description of Alexander in Against Apion, which was written after the fact? Okay, that's a decent question. Cohen's angle is to say that the Alexandrian Jews never heard of such a story. So Josephus didn't bring it up because they would have been like, dude, what are you talking about? Personally, I think this is really clever framing by Cohen, but a really misleading description by him to frame the Against Apion section as to portray Josephus as a kind of historical blunderhead, and to ultimately say at the end of the article that the whole Alexander story of him going to Jerusalem never happened. He just has to frame it in a certain way to just make that big conclusion at the end. Why I say that is by looking at the highlighted pieces here. When you hear a list of monarchs who sacrificed at a temple in Jerusalem or otherwise showed respect to the Jews, I bet that you naturally thought there's probably this multitude of kings that are described sacrificing in the temple and a multitude of them showing respect, right? Well, on the sacrificing list, there's only one Ptolemy king described sacrificing in Jerusalem, as you can see here from the search in the text. So, it's only one king described doing this, but is described doing it according to the Jewish customs, to the God of Israel. It's just like the Alexander story was described in Antiquities, and like he did when he was in Babylon. It's the same pattern. This is customary. Josephus is not borrowing or just making it up in his head. So, the whole portrayal here is definitely misleading. And I'm going to say it was intentional by Cohen, because I bet again, you were expecting a multitude of kings sacrificing. Like, oh man, there was like 7, but he never brought up Alexander. That's weird. He did it back in Antiquities, but over here in a later work, he brings all these up. But it was only one. And then the doubt just pours in from all that, right? All that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of, in my view, like this is how politicians talk. They never just bring it up honestly, the real facts. So all I can say is from all this kind of stuff is that, I'm actually thankful because outside of what I believe is I've been gifted with the gift of teaching by the Lord, is that I think that he's given me one other gift, and that is that he has given me the gift of discernment, to see how authors and presenters frame their statements in really clever ways to give false impressions. And for this one here is what makes Cohen's statement so misleading is because technically it's correct. He's not lying or giving false information, but it's framed in a way to cast doubt in your mind about Alexander visiting Jerusalem. If you think I'm off with this, ask yourself then, why didn't he just put the numbers in front of how many were for each? It doesn't cast as much doubt when you put the numbers there, does it? If you were a student of history, and also note that there were 25 kings in the Ptolemy line, and Josephus in the Against Apion section only brings up 6 of them. And here's the other deceptive piece to this, and it's with the otherwise showed respect to the Jews statement, because Josephus does describe Alexander being not just respectful, but extremely generous to the Jews by giving them places to live in Alexandria in Against Apion. And he did this as a reward to them because of their virtue and fidelity to him. And Josephus quotes Hecatios that Alexander didn't collect tribute, i.e. tax, from the country of Samaria. Just FYI, just go search Hecatius and Moses, okay? In the same search, you might like what you see, or might not like what you see if you're on the other side. So, was Alexander respectful to the Jews in Against Apion? Yes. But did Josephus omit Alexander's visit to Jerusalem? Yes. But was he being sloppy with his history? No. Why? Because, as Josephus cited his earlier work, is that he rips on critical Greeks for not believing his Antiquities work, which includes Apion, the one whom Josephus has in mind when he's writing this work. So, Josephus knows that Apion and others have read Antiquities. That includes Alexander visiting Jerusalem, sacrificing in the temple, and reading the book of Daniel. He doesn't need to repeat himself again in Against Apion. He actually just gave new information in Against Apion that wasn't previously noted in Antiquities. It's that simple. So, sorry, Cohen and critics, is that this type of argumentation is flat out wrong, and to call Josephus sloppy here is just utter garbage. Now, it doesn't mean that Cohen doesn't bring up some decent points in regard to the historicity of the account, as the rabbinic accounts don't match with Josephus, as the rabbinic account says the Samaritans asked Alexander permission to destroy the temple in Jerusalem, which he allowed, and both of the Samaritans and Alexander's army are said to march on Jerusalem. The high priest, too, is different in the rabbinic account, saying that it was Simon the righteous, not Jaddua. This is also mentioned in Leviticus Rabbah 13:5, with Alexander stopping the attack because he said he saw Simon's image in front of throughout his conquests. My quick counter to this is that this is coming from a rabbinic chronology standpoint, saying that King Darius was Queen Esther's son. So, who was the actual high priest at this time? That is pretty debated because of the differences in the stories and the chronologies that the authors adhere to. And it's not quite as simple as picking one over the other, as Josephus does seem to be taking Nehemiah 12's Sanballat character and dating him during the time of Alexander, or down-dating him to our modern chronology, that is. Needless to say, all this available data can't let anyone, and I mean anyone, say with absolute certainty which listing is correct. And there are some who say that these just actually harmonize with one another, as Jaddua and Simon the Righteous are the same person. That's a whole nother position. Down the road, I'll be coming back to this topic because when you get into this, what's the starting point of the 70 weeks, the chronology of Ezra and Nehemiah is really important, and there's varying views on it. There are differing views with the stories of which Artaxerxes is actually being referred to here, because there's multitudes of them out of the kings of Persia. So which one do you tag Nehemiah talking to in his stories? Artaxerxes 1, 2, 3? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But back to the rabbinic version here is that it does agree with Josephus by saying that Alexander bowed before the high priest because of his vision of him. But the stories end dramatically different, with the Jews killing the Samaritans who wanted to destroy the temple. So it's a Venn diagram with some commonalities, but also having some really big differences in their accounts. And someone might point out that the rabbis didn't mention anything about Alexander sacrificing or seeing the book of Daniel. But another could say that the rabbinic stories are coming a century plus after Josephus, who is using material that is coming from the pre-Christian era. So those three stands that Josephus is using predated the codified rabbinic stories by centuries. So to wrap up on Cohen's article with asking if his assessment of Josephus inserting the book of Daniel reference is correct, the answer is no, because he can't prove it. And by his very own standpoint of the three strands is that the narrative, or the description that is, of Alexander reading the book of Daniel in the temple after he came into the city and before he went out of the city fits perfectly within the second strand. And therefore, Cohen's conclusion that Alexander did not visit Jerusalem is also an overstatement by him. So, when you go onto forums and people make broad statements like, this is clearly all legendary as all acknowledge, is that is also wrong, because there's not even consensus, even in the critical camp, of if this is really a historical event, when did it happen? Nobody can agree, even with these four guys. Yes, neither side has the DeLorean to definitively prove with 100% certainty, but if you're going to simply dismiss the account because it contains the Book of Daniel reference in it, is that it shows that you're not using equal scales in your assessment. But you are in fact being intentionally biased against the account because of the ramifications that it brings to your secular worldview. Now, Against Apion needs to be first remembered as a work coming after Antiquities, and as a response to pagan Greek readers who didn't believe Josephus because they, the Jews, and their history are not plainly mentioned by the Greek historians, ancient Greek historians. Josephus rants on the Greeks for a little bit, then says the following in paragraph 8. For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from one and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. The 22 canonized divine books are said to have 5 belonging to Moses, which contain his laws and the traditions of the origin of mankind till his death. The interval of time was little short of 3,000 years. So, there's the Torah. Then Josephus says, but as to the time from the death of Moses till the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophets who were after Moses wrote down what was done in their times in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. So, Josephus's canon list would look like this, out of this description. He doesn't list out exactly who the 13 prophets or prophetical books are, or the 4 hymns, but we definitely know that Daniel is one of the 13 prophets in his Antiquities works. Yes, we could fill in Isaiah, we could fill in Jeremiah, we could do that easily, but we're just not going to. Athanasius, in his 39th letter, says the Hebrews had 22 books in their list, and he does go on listing them, in which it does include Daniel in the 22. The next part is worth noting from Josephus. He says the following. It is true, our history hath been written since Artaxerxes very particularly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. What Josephus is saying is that since roughly 425 BC, there haven't been any new prophets up until that point. And remember that first Maccabees said that they stored the defiled altar stones away because there is no prophet at that time that could answer the question of how they were to be handled after with the broken pieces. And this is dated to 164 BC, when the critics say that Daniel was composed. And prior to this, in chapter 2, the author referenced Daniel 3 and 6 stories, with the chapter dated to 166 BC, 2 years before the critics' composition date. So, critics have to argue that the entire Jewish population was fooled by the pseudo-writer or writers, and all of these external references to Daniel somehow just magically or anachronistically appeared in them. And, or they would always say the word redaction to make Daniel appear, early and predictive in nature. I'm sorry, but that dog simply does not hunt, because there's no way that that narrative could realistically occur. And look at how Josephus finishes off his view of divine scripture, and how firmly we have given credit to these books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages as have already passed, no one has been so bold as to either add anything to them, or to take anything from them, or to make any change in them. He says, no one is so bold, or really so stupid, as to change the Hebrew scripture canon. So, adding a new book like Daniel in the late 2nd century BC simply did not happen. Josephus emphasized the seriousness the Jews have with the Hebrew scriptures by saying, but it is become natural to all Jews immediately, and from their very birth, to esteem these books to contain divine doctrines, and to persist in them, and, if occasion, be willing to die for them. Now on to Josephus's 4 empire view. with his section on Daniel is that he does cover chapter 2 of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar's dream. There's not a need to go through all of it, but you can see that we are working off of that event, with the statue being described, except for the feet, are not described with being mixed with clay by Josephus. Josephus says that the head of gold is Babylon, but like before, he adds some interpretation into the story by saying that the kings before Nebuchadnezzar are also part of the head of gold. Historically, only Nebuchadnezzar's dad ruled with sovereignty over Babylon after defeating the Assyrians in 612 BC. Josephus goes on saying that Babylon is going to fall by 2 kings. This is the silver section, but again, Josephus adds in his interpretation that the crossed arms signified a unified empire with 2 kings. Later in chapter 11, he says the 2 kings were Cyrus and Darius. The identity of Darius we have covered before, so go check out that video for a really in-depth coverage of it. And from Josephus is that we see Darius was called by another name according to the Greeks, which was Cyaxares, number 2, the son of Astyages, who is referred to as Darius in Daniel, and the family chart here shows that he was the uncle of Cyrus the Great. This joint empire of the Medes and Persians is consistently described in the book of Daniel. And regardless if a person doesn't want to accept what the Bible says, is that historians, ancient historians, and reliefs all describe the Medes and Persians aligned together, or at worst has the Persians holding dominance over the Medes. But their combination all predated the fall of Babylon, not after. Either way, they are described as combined. So we definitely know that Josephus has Babylon as the first and Medo-Persia as the second empire in his scheme. Now on to the third. But another king that shall come from the west, armed with brass, shall destroy that second government. This too has an interpretive addition in the description, as a king coming from the west is not in Daniel 2. What Josephus did was incorporate Daniel 8's he-goat descriptions. Josephus does bring up Daniel 8's prophecies in chapter 8 of his work, and there he brings up the ram and goat. The goats, 4 horns that follow the great horn, then the little horn that comes out of one of the 4. Josephus sticks with Daniel 8, saying that the ram is the unified empire of the kingdoms of the Medes and Persians, and the goat is the Greek empire. So it's obvious that Josephus had the Greeks as the third empire, but in this process, we can add in his chapter 8 alignment with Daniel 2 in his scheme. The Greek little horn is identified as Antiochus Epiphanes by him. So when it comes to the Fourth Empire, I hope we all know what the critic's narrative is by this point. But those that are actually honest with themselves will say, hey, yeah, okay, Babylon's 1, Medo-Persia 2, Greek 3. But they'll usually try to say, oh, but the Seleucids are the 4th one. We have shown the numerous textual and historical problems with that approach. And Josephus didn't see the Seleucids as a separate empire either, as he, in Book 12, Chapter 7, discusses the fulfillment of Daniel 8's little horn with Antiochus Epiphanes. And here, Josephus sees Antiochus Epiphanes falling under the Third Empire umbrella of the Greek Empire, as Alexander was a Macedonian. So, Josephus is not splitting the Seleucids off and making them the 4th, as some critics try to do. So, identifying Josephus's 4th empire should be obvious by now, but we'll let him speak for himself, as right after in chapter 11's description of Antiochus is that Josephus says the following. In the very same manner, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. So, Rome is clearly the 4th, but Josephus wasn't saying Daniel 8 was about Rome. We'll actually come back to that question if that came in your head in a little bit. But back in chapter 10, covering the statue, is that he describes the 4th empire in the following way.
And another government that shall be like unto iron shall put an end to the power of the former, and shall have dominion over all the earth, on account of the nature of iron, which is stronger than that of gold, of silver, and of brass. We know that Josephus places Rome as the Iron Empire, as he sequentially has them after the Macedonian Empire, as does the rest of the world. And does this because history records Rome conquering each of the 4 sub-kingdoms, becoming the new superpower in the Mideast. Now, there's no way to argue against this 4-empire scheme of Josephus that we just laid out here. Now, what about the uncut stone from Daniel 2 you might be thinking about? Well, Josephus does mention it right after his Iron Empire description and says the following. Daniel did also declare the meaning of the stone to the king, but I, Josephus, do not think it proper to relate it, since I have only undertaken to describe things past or things present, but not things that are in the future. Yet, if anyone be so very desirous of knowing the truth as not to waive such points of curiosity, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding the uncertainties of futurity, and whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in reading the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. Now, what Josephus said was that the stone's destruction of the statue, that includes the 4th Empire, is still a future event. And that would come after the 70 AD destruction in his mind, and after 94 AD when Josephus wrote his Antiquities work. So, although Jerusalem and the temple have been leveled to the ground by the Romans, and Rome is only getting bigger and stronger at this point in history, is that Josephus believes and knows in his head that God is going to end them and all other pagan Gentile empires one day, and will establish his own global everlasting kingdom on earth. And I believe that Josephus didn't include this tidbit because he was probably a little bit afraid of some potential backlash. He's writing under Roman authority, so he kind of, tiptoed around this by not going into the end game of God himself destroying the empires. That includes Rome one day. Now, what prophecy of Daniel's was Josephus drawing upon when he said that Rome was prophesied to make the nation of Israel desolate by them? What I think is obvious here is that Josephus was referring to the 70 AD destruction. I think everybody should agree on that point. The city and temple were leveled to the ground, so they were desolate. Now, out of Daniel's prophecies is that you can see here that Josephus does not bring up Daniel 7, 9, or 11 through 12 in his work. Daniel 7:25 is the closest that chapter has with the 4th Empire, gets to talking about destroying the city and temple, but there's nothing in the text that deals exactly with that situation. It's more about the little horn persecuting the people like Antiochus did, not about destroying the city or the temple. So I think it's safe to say that that wasn't what Josephus had in mind. And this is a key reminder that Josephus is a futurist in regards to the 4th Empire's ultimate destruction, which, by logical extension, Josephus would understand Daniel 7:25 as future as well. And so, also, neither does Daniel 11 through 12 talk about the city and temple being destroyed. That parallels Daniel 7 with future everlasting righteousness in God's kingdom. So, chapter 11 through 12 should be eliminated as well, leaving only the 70 weeks prophecy, which does contain a prophecy of Jerusalem and the temple being destroyed with the key word Sahat that has use with total destruction of the earth with a flood, or the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem. So you get the idea. It's a total wiping out effect. Now, an argument that could be made against this is that Josephus didn't use the same root word. However, Daniel 9:2 does, with the 70 years of desolation of Jerusalem, which was a total destruction of the city and temple. And Luke in 21:20 has it too with Jesus' prophecy of the temple being destroyed, and I might add 40 years in advance. So it's not a deal breaker that Josephus had a different word choice than the Septuagint, because there's a whole nother video as to why there's a difference in there. Whereas Josephus was using Daniel 9:2's term, the Greek translation term. So I think it's safe to say that 926 was what Josephus had in mind, and that his four empire scheme is as such, along with this now giving us his potential 70 weeks view, our first glimpse of it. But before moving on to that, is that let's look at how Josephus closes out this section on Daniel's prophecies. All these things did this man leave in writing, as God had showed them to him, insomuch that such as read his prophecies, and see how they have been fulfilled, would wonder at the honor wherewith God would honor Daniel, and may thence discover how the Epicureans are in error, who cast providence out of human life, and do not believe that God takes care of the affairs of the world, nor that the universe is governed and continued in being by that blessed and immortal nature. But say that the world is carried along of its own accord, without a ruler or a curator, which were it destitute of a guide to conduct it, as they imagine, it would be like ships without pilots, which we see drowned by the winds, or like chariots without drivers, which are overturned. So would the world be dashed to pieces by its being carried without a providence, and so perish and come to naught. Doesn't this sound a lot like how naturalists speak today? So that, by the forementioned predictions of Daniel, those men seem to me very much to err from the truth, who determine that God exercises no providence over human affairs. Now as to myself, I have so described these matters as I have found them and read them. But if anyone is inclined to another opinion about them, let him enjoy his different sentiments without any blame from me. So as we transition into focusing on solely Josephus' potential 70 weeks view, is that we know that we just picked up one piece with the 70 AD destruction fulfilling Daniel 9:26b in Josephus' mind, with him saying previously that Daniel's prophecies were unique when compared to all other prophets, because his included predictions that had a time component in them. That being said, is that we can start with this current layout for his potential 70 weeks view. In regards to the Mashiachs in 925 and 926a, is that we don't know if Josephus read it as referring to one or two people, because he never comments on when the 70 weeks start, or anything about 925 through 926a. What I can most assuredly say is that Josephus wouldn't agree with the rabbis in regards to chronology, as he dates Daniel 8's prophecy 408 years before Antiochus' desolation. We know from 1 Maccabees 1:5-4 that 167 BC is the abomination of desolation in the 145th year by subtracting it from 312 BC when the Seleucids came to power. This is matched by Josephus with him adding the synchronization to the 153rd Olympiad. If you remember that some early church writers used the Olympiad's era system to mark their 70-week system like Cyril did. The main thing is that the first Olympiad began in 776 BC. A mistake a person could make, though, here is to simply subtract 612 years from 776 BC and land on 164 BC and think that there's some type of historical error here by Josephus. That's not the case, as you need to lay this out in grid form for each year of each Olympiad to make sure that you are mapping them out correctly. So when you do that, is that you do see that the second year of the 153rd Olympiad overlapped Antiochus' desolation in 167 BC. and is why Josephus said on the 153rd Olympiad. So he was correct in saying the desolation took place there. But what it means is that Josephus dates Daniel's 8th prophecy to 575 BC, which is 24 years earlier than modern chronology places it, with the 3rd year of Belshazzar in 551 BC. But this is far more accurate than rabbinic chronology that places Daniel 8 in 351 BC. This is just another demonstration of how the rabbis gutted out 166 years of Persian and Greek history to fit their system. Now, Roger Beckwith calculated Josephus's dating of the exile starting in 640 BC, and therefore places the 1st year of Cyrus to 570 BC, which Josephus said at that point the Jews had been exiled for 70 years in Babylon. William Whiston, whose English translation of the Antiquities is the one we and most people use, has book titles of the number of years between each key event. Books 11 and 12 are the ones we will quickly look at here. If you use his calculated numbers, then you would start at 160 BC for Judas Maccabeus' death. It's safe to say that Josephus would go with this date, with the 167 desolation date, that is. Then, adding on 170, 253, and 70 is that you get the respected dates. These are a little closer to the conventional dates, but absolutely nowhere near the rabbinic ones. So, even though we don't have an exact starting date, is that we at least know that he's not going with a rabbi system and dating the First Temple destruction to 420 BC like they do. Overall, I think it's best and honest to just put a question mark over 925 for Josephus. But this doesn't prevent us from still trying to determine if Josephus saw this prophecy messianically, or if anything, who might have been in his thought of who was that Mashiach that was cut off in 926a. With regards to the 70th week, is that again, we need to remember that Josephus is a futurist, I'm going to pound that a little bit, in regards to the Fourth Empire's ultimate destruction. So, it's on the table if Josephus put the 70th week with the 70 AD destruction, or if he saw it as a future event. So we have gleaned off what we could from Antiquities in regards to his potential 70 weeks view. This leaves us with his wars account for us to cover in the study. A really useful and freely available article is Steve Mason's Josephus, Daniel, and the Flavian House. Steve is best known for his work with Josephus and how his works relate with the New Testament and Christianity's rise in the 1st century. He also has commentaries on Josephus's works too. In this article, Steve brings up F.F. Bruce's view on Josephus's war book and its possible connection to Daniel 9. I have this article, one here of Bruce's, highlighted because if anyone out there knows how to retrieve this thing, please send me a link or something, because I have been searching for a really long time and I just can't find it or find a way to access it, and it will be really valuable for a future video. Steve says, though, that Bruce saw Josephus identifying what he called a succession of abominations. So Daniel 9:27 would be at play here. Bruce believes that Josephus's references of the sanctuary being polluted is an abomination in Josephus's eyes. Bruce also points to the appointment of an unworthy high priest, the assassination of the former high priest Ananus, the daily sacrifice ceasing, Roman soldiers sacrificing to their standards in the temple court, the temple destruction, internal strife among Jews, and the expectation of a world ruler from Judea by the Jews. Looking at this as a composite list, is that this list does kind of sound a lot like Daniel 9. And if the dots truly do connect, then we can say with good assurance that Josephus saw the 70th week pertaining to the 70 AD destruction. But the fulfillment of Daniel 2 remains as a future event with a uncut stone in his mind. So let's take a look at Bruce's point, points and see if they do connect. First, starting with Josephus saying the temple was polluted. 2 times this description is given by Josephus. The they here is not about the Romans, but the varying Jewish groups who were rebelling, and some causing a lot of infighting amongst the Jews themselves. The second time he uses this, he says that the sacred floor was defiled along with polluting the sanctuary. Now, the Greek lemma for both cases is miano. A New Testament example of this is in Titus 1:15, and here you can see that each one is used with is differently inflected, like that with Josephus. A great free online resource, if you really want to get in the weeds of this kind of stuff, is this lexicon on Kata Biblon. And as you can see, it breaks down the Septuagint uses as well. It's not a photocopy like Thayer's lexicon that you will find on Blue Letter Bible. With that is that we can actually do some quick searching here to see if the Greek translators of Daniel use this word. And we can see here that 3 times it was used by the Greek translators for Daniel. Now, if you're looking in here close and you're wondering why is OG beside DN for Daniel, is because that is referring to the Old Greek version of Daniel, because there's actually 2 Greek translations of Daniel. The other is called the Theodotion, which miano was not used in it, but it was used in the Old Greek translation. What you might be noticing is that Daniel 9 is not in any of the 3 highlighted uses here. But if you really got your motor running on everything in Daniel, is that you probably did spot 11:31, because that verse contains one of the 3 times that abomination of desolation appears in the book of Daniel, and the translator does use miano in the same verse. But what this actually tells you is that polluting of the temple is not synonymous with setting up something abominable in the Holy of Holies, like a statue of Zeus, like Antiochus did. The 3 times that Daniel says abomination of desolation are the following. For each of these, we can see how the Greek versions, the 2 Greek versions, translated them. In 9:27 here, they agree with one another. However, in 11:31, the Theodotion didn't use the same word for desolation. Why? I got a reason, or I got my own belief, but that's for another video. And then again in 12:11, where they're again on the same page. In 1 Maccabees 1:5-4, you see the same Greek phrasing for its use of abomination of desolation. And in the New Testament, the 2 times Jesus refers to the abomination of desolation is that they are used as well. Which all begs the question, did Josephus use that phrase or Greek words in relation to polluting descriptions? And the answer is no. As Mason says, Josephus nowhere uses Greek Daniel bedeiluma. That unusual term would have drawn immediate attention to Daniel's famous prophecy if Josephus had so intended. Which is correct, because we saw earlier that Josephus was using the same term out of Daniel 9:2. And there's a reason why the Greek of 9:26 doesn't have this word used. But again, that's for another video. It just gets really weedy. Needless to say, Josephus did not overtly associate the polluting descriptions with the abomination of desolation when he so easily could have. My only pushback against me on this is that he doesn't use that phrase when describing Antiochus either in Antiquities, including when he describes Antiochus' sacrificing of a pig on the altar. So it's hard to imagine Josephus not seeing this event, Antiochus, as an abomination of desolation, even though he didn't use those words. Or, maybe he didn't find that it was necessary to use those words because everyone knew it from 1 Maccabees 1:5-4, and Josephus himself was just simply, I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more with the whole pig getting slaughtered on there too, and that's what made it so abominable. Regardless, the fact is that Josephus does not use the Septuagint Bdelema with the affairs, which strongly indicates he was not associating Daniel 9:27's abomination with the first AD Jewish war. Mason went on saying in the article, moreover, his sayings about temple catastrophes are part of a much larger priestly cultic theme in the war that is not dependent on Daniel. Finally, Josephus gives numerous causes of the city's destruction. Ananus's death is part of a larger story of rebel atrocities that, once again, is not grounded in Daniel. This is big because often you will hear that Ananus's death as a possible proposal to who the Mashiach in 926a is that was cut off. And Mason is saying I'm sorry, that just doesn't work. Collectively, Mason demonstrates that Bruce's reasoning just doesn't add up at the end of the day. Now, with that conclusion is that we're not just done with Bruce, because one of his points is that he does bring up Josephus' statement at the very end about a widespread Jewish expectation of a world ruler from Judea at that time. But Josephus, in hindsight, says that, yeah, but that was about Emperor Vespasian. Now, Mason says that Bruce is connecting Josephus' statement to 926's coming prince. But Mason correctly says that the problem with this theory is that the coming leader of 926 in the Masoretic text is evidently not favored by God. His army, coming leader, will destroy the city and the sanctuary and his, or its, and will be in a flood. This is correct. Josephus would not have associated the Jewish Messiah with the coming prince, as he is the one who commits the abomination of desolation in 927. The issue for Bruce, Mason, and many others is that they refuse or willing to consider or bring up the Mashiach references in 925 or 926a as possibilities for Josephus, because he flat out says that at that time the Jews were expecting their new David, and we saw earlier that Josephus only gives Daniel the credit of providing a timeline with his prophecies of future events. So, to shy away from the 70 weeks prophecy cannot happen because it's the only one within Daniel, who's the only guy, that has a chronology component to it. And look what Josephus says in Wars in the preceding lines to this. Now, if anyone consider these things, he will find that God takes care of mankind, and by all ways possible foreshows to our race what is for their preservation, but that men perish by those miseries which they madly and voluntarily bring upon themselves. For the Jews, by demolishing the Tower of Antonia, had made their temple foursquare, while at the same time they had it written in their sacred oracles that then should their city be taken as well as their holy house, when once their temple should become foursquare. This reference, without question, is Daniel 926b. And what Josephus is saying is that the Jews had such messianic fever and expectation going on is that they totally forgot and missed the part that Daniel also said that one day Jerusalem and the second temple are going to be destroyed again. This solidifies that our interpretation in Antiquities is correct in that Josephus saw the 70 AD fulfillment in Daniel 926b. So, Josephus says the Jews forgot this prophecy, and he follows this up by saying, but now, what did most elevate them? That is, give them the courage and the confidence to undertake this war against the Romans. Well, it was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, how, about that time, one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth. The Jews took this prediction to belong to themselves in particular, and many of the wise men were thereby deceived in their determination. Now, This oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian, who was appointed emperor in Judea. The appointment in Judea is in reference to the fact that Vespasian was declared emperor by the Roman military during the siege of Jerusalem. He, Vespasian, leaves to take official control back in Rome, and in that process he leaves his son Titus in command of the forces at Jerusalem, and Titus is the one who ultimately destroys the city and the temple. In another great article, Roger Beckwith speculated back in 1981 that Josephus was thinking of the Son of Man from Daniel 7:13. That was the one that was really pointing to Vespasian. The clear-cut problem with that is that the Son of Man is given eternal, everlasting kingdom, and is the one who defeats the Fourth Empire, and Josephus showed this understanding as well with Daniel 2's uncut stone. But Daniel 7 is the most explicit that the Messiah will rule over the whole entire earth after defeating the Fourth Empire, whereas the other Daniel prophecies aren't that explicit. So Daniel 7 could have easily been in the minds of the Jewish people. They were expecting a conquering Davidite, and Daniel 7 fits that bill. But, Daniel 7 cannot account for Josephus saying that the oracle was ambiguous and had a chronological component to it. And so, Josephus said, only Daniel does that, and only in Daniel 9 does it provide a timeline that does include messianic language in it, and without question has proven itself to be the most debated on and confusing or ambiguous prophecy for interpreters over the past 2,000 years. And you could even see this referred to by Roman historian Tacitus, who says, most Jews held the belief that, according to the ancient priestly writings, this was the moment in which the East was fated to prevail. They would now start forth from Judea and conquer the world. This enigmatic prophecy really applied to Vespasian and Titus, but men are blinded by their hopes. The Jews took them to themselves the promised destiny, and even defeat could not convince them of the truth. Also, Suetonius wrote on Emperor Vespasian saying that a firm persuasion had long prevailed through all the East, that it was fated for the empire of the world at that time to devolve on some who should go forth from Judea. This prediction referred to a Roman emperor as the event showed, but the Jews applied it to themselves. Both Tacitus and Suetonius's statements reflect Josephus's and makes it clear that the Jews were thinking of the Fourth Empire's destruction at that time and were using the 70 weeks prophecy as their basis. This explains why there was such messianic fever going on in the 1st century AD, and so many Messiah claimants or people who the Jewish people saw potentially as the Messiah at that time. And Ben Zion Wacholder wrote a great article about how all early 1st AD Messianic movements were tied to the 70 weeks prophecy, and the timing of them occurred in conjunction with sabbatical years. All of this demonstrates that Josephus' statement is 100% alluding to Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. His allusion doesn't let us know if he, Josephus, personally saw the 70 weeks messianically prior to or after the 70 AD destruction. His view could have changed. So, for our purposes here, is that this is all we can definitively chart out for his view. We don't know where he was starting from. We don't know if he possibly had a gap in mind with the 70th week being still a future event. It leans that way, I believe. But at the end of the day, we just don't get a clear-cut overall opinion from him. But the one thing that we can most assuredly say is that his allusion shows that the pre-70 AD Jewish people saw the 70 weeks messianically and were expecting the Messiah's arrival in that time period. We've already shown in the Qumran video that in 11Q Melchizedek that community clearly sees Daniel 9's Mashiach as the promised Messiah, and is the Messiah, the divine Melchizedek figure from Psalm 110, who is God himself, and they, the Qumran community, predicted his arrival using the 70 weeks prophecy to be around 3 to 1 BC. And even the rabbinic movement after the 70 AD destruction shows that they, the Jews, were still trying to predict the Messiah's arrival by using the 70 weeks. Because Megillah 3a says that the reason why Rabbi Jonathan ben Unziel was denied permission to translate the books in the writings, just to break in here quickly, is that this is in reference to the third section of the Tanakh being translated into Aramaic by Rabbi Jonathan for his Targum that has Daniel fallen in the writings section. Back to Megillah 3a, where he was saying that this was denied because it has in it a revelation of the end when the Messiah will arrive. The end is foretold in a cryptic manner in the book of Daniel. So, you have Jewish interpretation before and after 70 AD consistently saying that the 70 weeks prophecy is about the Messiah and it does predict his arrival. Which begs the question to all the naysayers out there is, how much more proof do you really need that this is about the Messiah? Because, let's just be honest with ourselves here for a little bit, with a little bit of logic thrown in. Since Daniel 9:26b is about the 70 AD destruction, and Daniel 9:25 through 26a is about the Messiah's arrival, is that logically it means that his arrival had to come before 70 AD. And I really doubt that I need to elaborate on which candidate perfectly falls within this time period.
Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.